from the thick woods adjoining the field. Just after turning and starting from the end, he was shot in the back. 2 shots almost at the same instant took effect. He tried to hold the horse, which started to run, and even after falling, was dragged for some distance. The horse ran for the house or barn and came to a gate at the bottom of the field. My grandfather, Jesse Greer, had refugeed from his home near Trade, Tennessee, and was living in one of the father's houses. He and his family realized what had happened. They could hear my sister screaming and calling out that father had been killed. The place where he had fallen was a steep hillside, and my grandfather hitched another horse to his sled and put my wounded father on it and took him to his home. My mother's sister, Polly Greer Jones, riding the horse my father had been plowing, ran him to the Alfred Sutherland home, and on the way told my mother that father had been killed. As she crossed the river from our home into the highway, she met Lizzie Stout and Peggy Potter. And Ms. Weaver, let me pause just a second here from the reading. Peggy Potter was my great-great-grandmother.
So,
and she was a widow at this time. She was a Thomas before she was married and closely allied with the Wilson family, the Thomases and the Wilsons. Okay, reading again. The stout woman lived only a few hundred yards on the highway downstream, and Mrs. Potter lived 1/4 of a mile on the highway upstream. My aunt told them that Lieutenant Isaac Wilson had been killed, and the stout woman let out a terrible scream, which my aunt thought expressed sorrow. But Mrs. Potter, who was a real friend of our family afterwards, said Lizzie Stout had uttered, "Thank God," in a subdued tone. My aunt soon informed Alfred Sutherland and his family of the deed, and 2 of the Sutherland boys, Doc and 1 other, went as rapidly as they could in the direction of Creston. Nathan Lewis lived in the vicinity of Ashland, and Wiley Thomas, Jack Baker, and others were informed, and before night they had come to our home. Alfred Thomas's family, as his wife Melinda was a daughter of Lemuel Wilson, a first cousin of my father, were asked to let my grandfather, Harm Wilson, know that my father had been killed, and Riley Thomas carried the sad news. It was almost dark before my grandfather reached our home. When my father was carried to the house and placed on a cot, which had been moved to the middle of the room, he was still alive, but not able to speak. I was youngest of 7 children, but as I remember, I even could see he was dying. My grandfather Greer was adept in caring for the sick, and when my mother urged sending for Dr. Houston, who lived at Shounds in Tennessee, he said it would avail nothing, for my father could live only a few minutes. I think he lived less than an hour after he was laid out on the couch. I remember many of the things that took place while the corpse was being laid out. It was suggested that someone should shave him, and Nathan Lewis offered to do it. Later, Mr. Lewis, who was the father of Wilburn and Andy Lewis, and Mrs. James Cornett, and Mrs. Dave Osborne, moved to our community, and we all remembered it and were very fond of him. The Wall and McQueen murders and the attempt to hang the elderly Landry Eggers had convinced the people that something had to be done to check the outrages. Some of my father's best friends accompanied my grandfather from Watauga, and among them was Gil Norris. He was the first to act. Listening to the conversation of the women and children, he heard them accusing Tom Stout, our nearest neighbor, of being a scout for those who had killed my father. Neither Stout nor any member of his family had put in an appearance at our home the whole day, and taking Joe McGuire and Butler McBride, he went to the Stout's house and arrested him. He was guarded at my grandfather Jesse Greer's house during the night, and taken to our home and kept under strict guard all day while preparations were being made for father's burial, which took place the day following his murder. John Baker, Wiley Thomas, and Dan Shepard were determined men and decided to go into action at once. It was learned from a number of sources that old Andy Potter, Rube Potter, his oldest son, and young Andy Potter had done the shooting. Amanda Snyder, daughter of Adam Snyder, who later became the wife of John Potter, a brave Confederate soldier, said she had seen Silvers Arnold guiding the Potters through the woods of their plantation late in the afternoon before the murder, but that he had no gun. It was thought that some successful raids might be made across the Tennessee line, and as soon as dark, Wiley Thomas and some others, Uncle Wilburn Greer, did not want to go to his old home at Trade, but told Wiley Thomas and his party that they might catch Harm Maines at a Warren woman's house just before the Jesse Greer place. When they reached the house, the door was barred, and when broke in, Wiley Thomas was attacked by Maines, who was a powerful man, and hurled to the floor. But while Wiley was being unmercifully beaten, he succeeded in getting hold of his pistol and fired a shot which instantly killed Maines. A Mr. Dotson, who had married a daughter of widow Peggy Potter, had successfully escaped the conscription officers, fell into the hands of this raiding party, and was captured. He tried to escape, was shot and killed while running away. I'll pause again here to comment, Ms. Weaver. The Mr. Dotson we read about married Nancy Potter. He had come into his home to see his wife and 3-month-old daughter. Her name was Mary. I knew her as Aunt Sis. And was killed as he tried to get away. Nancy Potter Dotson, a widow now, married Thomas Jefferson Barlow after the Civil War, who was my great-grandmother and great-grandfather. Okay, reading again. John Baker, Wilburn Greer, and a few others who were with them watched the paths leading from Tennessee in the direction of their home all night, but saw no one passing. Early the next morning, while near a meadow belonging to Jehu Wilson, they saw coming up a ridge a woman whom both Wilburn Greer and a boy named Horton Canner identified as Lizzie Stout. They hid in the tall grass and weeds, and Wib Greer, always up to mischief, told his companions he was going to grab her by the leg when she came up, but John Baker scolded him, and they remained quiet and let her pass. She frequently made sounds intended for someone whom she expected to be on the lookout for the conscription officers. All at once she turned back, and they knew she had seen someone who was returning from the place where my father had been shot. They remained in hiding and soon saw Silvers Arnold climbing up the hillside. They let him come within 40 steps of the path when the whole party fired and left Arnold dead. He fell just below a big wild cherry tree, which has remained standing till the last few years. The stump may be there still. Friends and members of the family of Lieutenant Wilson had come from all directions to attend the funeral, and the situation was tense. Tom Stout was being closely guarded by Gil Norris, Jackson McBride, and others. The Jackson McBride here mentioned was a first cousin of my father, of the same age, and they were much alike in appearance and had been inseparable companions from childhood. A grave was dug not far from our home, and my father was the first to be buried there. The burial was over by 1 or 2 o'clock, and the people began to disperse. One of the most exciting incidents was that Gil Norris made Tom Stout mount behind him, and with a few other guards they all started off as fast as their horses could run. While none of the Stout family had been at the funeral, Lizzie Stout soon knew her husband, who had scouted for the Potters who had killed my father, would be hanged. They headed for Watauga by way of Trade, Tennessee, and after reaching Zionsville, turned to the left and followed the road along the rich mountain by Silverstone. Moving on some 6 or 7 miles in the direction of Boone, they halted and hanged Tom Stout, as he was thought to have done most of the planning of Lieutenant Wilson's murder. Again, let me pause. This is what I have heard from some of the elder people around, that Tom Stout was hanged somewhere up on Rich Mountain. His wife, widow, later in the year found the remains and carried them back home in her apron and buried him. She had identified his remains by his clothing and found the noose that he had been hanged with. Reportedly, they were taking him to Morganton, to the prison, the Confederate prison, but
they took things in their own hand.
They didn't get that far.
I didn't get that far.
Okay, reading again. We have seen that prior to this that a certain Madron had been shot and that Bill Arnold had been wounded when a band of these bushwhackers were attempting to rob the aged Landrine Eggers, who was supposed to have a lot of gold. The bushwhackers thought they had been beaten off by the home guard, while his own family and some of his neighbors were the only defenders. Actually, his daughter fired the shot that killed Madron. They were so sure that Eggers' home was strongly defended, they did not try to recover Madron's body, and afterwards sent a boy, Frank Grayson, with a sled to haul the body back to Roan's Creek. Later, the conscription officers had tried to take Jack Potter when he ran away and was shot. Then followed the killing of Wall at Chown, Sam McQueen at Forge Creek, and the following day, Lieutenant Isaac Wilson, Hiram Maines, Dotson, Silvers Arnold, and then the hanging of Tom Stout. The Potters soon found out that my father had not been with the home guard when Jack Potter was killed, but that Big Ike, Isaac Wilson, was the one. This was Isaac Wilson, son of Lemuel Wilson, who was a first cousin of my father. Big Ike had married Lucretia Wilson, a sister of Lieutenant Wilson, daughter of Hiram Wilson. Big Ike lived on the North Fork of Cove Creek at what is now called the Jasper Thomas place. An attack was made on Big Ike Wilson at his home, and he was shot through the body, and it was feared he would die. His wife and children placed him on a sled as the road to the Cove Creek Highway was too rough for a wagon. He was taken to George Younce's and there placed on a one-horse wagon, and the decision was made to move him to the distant place of his ancestors in Davidson County near Lexington. He had a cousin, John Lemuel Wilson, who lived where Jeff Wilson now lives near Tyro in Davidson County. There he recovered from his wounds and later moved back to Watauga County and lived in Boone till his death. This was the last house in the east end of Boone. Later John Hardin and others built east of him. I think the Methodist Church is on the old Isaac Wilson home site. In 1938, in company with my daughter, Mrs. Haywood Smith of Farmville, North Carolina, I visited the original Wilson settlement and was referred to John Wilson at Tyro. He has died since. He was pretty old and feeble, and his daughter, Mrs. Davis, said she feared he could tell very little, but he remembered the wounded refugee, whose name was Isaac Wilson. And when I told him my father was Lieutenant Isaac Wilson, he gave me a full account of Big Ike and his family. He said the wounded man was perfectly helpless when he reached his cousin's home, but improved rapidly. John Wilson was the son of Henderson Wilson, who was a brother of John Lemuel, so his father was a first cousin of Big Ike Wilson. They could claim kinship, and John told me he and other children joined Nancy Wilson and Ellen Wilson, the little refugees, in picking blackberries. He spoke of Aunt Chrissy, whose real name was Lucretia. Big Ike's home in Boone was not far from the famous old Daniel Boone cabin, the location of which is still marked. Ellen Wilson, as I remember, died about 1880, and Nancy was married to Tom Critcher, who lived about 6 miles east of Boone. In 1900, when I was on leave of absence from my missionary work in Japan, I, with my wife and 4 of our children, visited Aunt Lucretia, who was then living with the Tom Critchers. She was about 80 years old. Mrs. Ida Finch, whose mother was a Wilson and daughter of John Lemuel Wilson, has in her possession a letter written to family by Aunt Lucretia Wilson on the death of her husband Isaac Wilson, and mentioning the fact that she had gone to live with her daughter Mrs. Critcher. This was something like 20 years after the war. Alexander Wilson, an older brother of Isaac, was captured by the bushwhackers and imprisoned in the Mountain City jail, tried and sentenced to be hanged. Landon Snyder, whose sister Alex had married, had become a federal soldier and helped him break jail and make his escape. Albert Pinckney Wilson, a brother of Lucretia Wilson and an uncle of mine, lived only a few miles from the Critcher home, and we visited him at the same time. He lived to be 103 years, a record as far as I know, in the Wilson family.